From the Moscow headquarters, Radio VR, the voice of Russia.
You're listening to Radio VR. I'm Rob Sachs. Perhaps there's no figure as divisive in Israel's history as former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was laid to rest earlier this week. He was described in the media as a war thug and also as a peace hero. Perhaps he's most notorious for a massacre that occurred under his watch during a 1982 war with Lebanon. Many also hold him responsible for sparking the Second Intifada in 2000 with his controversial visit to the Temple Mount. But Sharon surprised many when just a few years later he pushed for the abandonment of settlements in Gaza in an effort to restart the peace process. I want to talk about Sharon's legacy and the future of Israel, so we've assembled an international panel. In Washington, we welcome Dan Arbell. He's a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. He's also a veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service. Welcome to you.
Good morning. Good to be here.
In Moscow, we're welcoming Dmitry Maryasis. He is the head of the Israel Department at the Institute for Asian and Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Welcome to you, sir.
Good day. I'm not the head of the Israel Department, but a research fellow there, but still I'm happy to be here.
Well, we gave you an undue promotion, but
Thank you.
We're hoping that maybe
Thank you.
someday you'll be head of the department, a research fellow there. Okay, and in London, we're joined by Jonathan Sacerdoti. He is a political commentator and Middle East analyst. Welcome to you, sir.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's start off with you, Dan Arbell. You just came back from Israel, and you were witnessing what Israelis were feeling and reacting to from the passing of Sharon, and during the funeral and the memorial services. What was the mood there in Israel?
Well, it was very interesting to be in Israel in the last few days to witness what was going on. Many Israelis were mourning former Prime Minister Sharon, despite the fact that he was out of public life for the last 8 years. As you all know, he was in a vegetative state following a massive stroke back in early 2006. Many people felt, they missed him, and mostly his presence, his leadership, his biography being basically the biography of the State of Israel. And despite the fact, as you mentioned, that he was a very controversial figure in Israel, in the Israeli public, and in the region, he was revered by many, and so many people did feel a sense of loss as he passed away.
And Jonathan Sacerdoti, let's talk about why he was revered, first off, and we can begin with his military career, where he had quite a number of high-profile successes, including leadership during the Yom Kippur War. What made him so successful overall as a military commander?
Well, he in many ways epitomized the Israeli people, but in his original success as a military leader, as you rightly point out, and also in his development during his life into the other manifestations of the personality that we all know about. But as you say, he started out as a military leader, and in the Yom Kippur War, he led the crossing of the Suez Canal, which helped secure an Israeli victory in the war and eventual peace with Egypt, and really proved his abilities as a military man at that time. I mean, he acted, some would say, he did act against orders. He acted according to his own beliefs as a military man, and it was proven to work. I was watching in some of the coverage of his life over the last few days an interview with him where he was asked if the crossing of the Suez Canal was a stroke of military genius and brilliance, or whether it was an act of craziness, as those were the two options given to him by the interviewer. And with a wry smile, he declared, of course, that it was both. And I think that really summed up his abilities as a military leader quite well.
And Dmitry Maryasis, he was described as a bulldozer. We just heard him talking about this, this description of crossing the Suez Canal and, defying orders and things like that. But I guess that worked for and against him, this idea that he just plowed through this determination.
Well, of course, but we all can see that he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he didn't hesitate to do it. It is important to understand. It is very important to leader in the war when you know exactly what you want to do, where you're going to lead your soldiers, and what you're going to do in the second, and you don't hesitate to do it. That's what he did. And of course, different people estimate it differently. He's a very controversial figure, we have to admit it, but through his military life and through his political life, we see that he clearly stated what he wanted. He tried everything he could to achieve it, and basically he was a success in this. I mean, he achieved even sometimes quite different goals. At first to make settlements, then to destroy settlements. I mean, he was a success.
Well, Dan Arbell, let's get into some of the more controversial aspects of his career. I mentioned at the outset what happened in 1982 with this war in Lebanon, where under his watch there were Christian fighters who were there who were basically let loose on the population, and this massacre ensued, and he was criticized for not stopping it. Can you talk about that incident and how it affects his legacy?
Well, the Sabra and Shatila events, refugee camps in Lebanon in '82, in which dozens of innocent Lebanese Palestinian refugees were killed by Christian militias, was a very tragic event in the history of the Lebanon war, and sort of changed the nature and the direction of that war. At that time, there was a close alliance between Israel and the Christian militias, but Israeli forces did not enter those refugee camps, but under their noses, Christian militias entered and carried out this massacre. Later, a special investigative committee was established in Israel, headed by a Supreme Court justice, the Kahan Committee, the Kahan Commission, which looked into this very thoroughly, into these events, and concluded that, as you said, that under the watch of then Defense Minister Sharon, these events took place, and the cozy nature of the relationship between Israel and the Christian militias sort of were the background or set the stage for these terrible events to take place, and found that Sharon at least carried some responsibility. He did not orchestrate this massacre, he did not order that to take place, he did not have any involvement in actually having the forces enter, but it was under his watch, and so he suffered the consequences, and he obviously had to resign from his position as defense minister.
And when you look at something like that, Jonathan Sacerdoti, what does that say about his personality? Was there a callousness toward Palestinians? Did he not care, or was he incompetent? I mean, how can we view that when we try to assess who he is as a larger person?
It's a good question, and there's been plenty of discussion over the last few days about exactly that. I don't think it's fair to say that he didn't care for the Palestinians, but I think that also we need to remember that the time of his active life, especially at that stage, we're talking about 1982 at the moment, the conflict was somewhat different from the one we know today, which, of course, like everything, it's developed and it's changed over the years. Simply put, the attitudes on all sides were quite different back then, which is not to say that I do agree with your suggestion that he didn't care, but what he did know as a leader, whether it was as a military leader or whether it was as defense minister or even later on as prime minister, I think what he symbolized to many Israelis was power and strength. And I think that he not only believed, but to some extent proved and showed that attitude of power and strength was one that could enable him to protect Israel and defend Israel, the country he cared about passionately, above and beyond ideology. He could protect it from the threats, from invading armies, from terrorism, from militias and guerrillas, and he could defend it in that way. And later in his career, he was able to use similar strength, but in a political arena, and he was able to use strength with his own people, and in many ways beat the potential of what was talked about as possibly turning into a civil war with the settler movement when he decided to withdraw all Israeli presence from the Gaza Strip. So I think above all else, what we can see as a common feature throughout his career, whether it was in the military or in politics, was that strength and that belief that strength was ultimately what would enable him and the State of Israel to resolve the problems and defend itself in the way that he knew it had to.
I want to get into that decision to remove settlements from the Gaza Strip in just a minute, but also want to go back to this incident in 2000 where he had this controversial visit to the Temple Mount that really upset many Palestinians and many say was the catalyst for the second intifada. Dmitry Maryasis, talk to us about that incident. What do you think was behind it? Many say he claims it was innocent, but some say that he should have known better and that it would create such an uproar. What do you make of that occurrence?
Well, I don't think that this visit to Arbell really catalyzed the conflict. Because you see, the facts that I interpret it like this. When the first Intifada in 1887, it was really, it happened like from nowhere. I mean, it was an accident, and then it happened, the whole Intifada sprang out. But I think that the second Intifada was well prepared. And you see this timing. You see that it was just between the Camp David negotiations of Yasser Arafat and Taba negotiations. It was just in the middle. And we could see it in the year 2000 that Arafat wasn't really ready, and his team, they were not really ready to accept all the proposals that the Israeli leadership was ready to give to Palestinians. And I think the Intifada was a good answer. Sharon was not the first man to enter that place, and he was not the first Jew and Israeli to enter that place, and it wasn't his first time there. Of course, he understood that there will be lots of attention to his visit, but I don't believe that it was really the catalyzation of some kind of people's rage against him visiting there. I think it was well planned and well done by some forces within Palestine.
Dan Arbell, what's your take on it?
I agree with Dmitry that definitely it did spark quite a reaction from the Palestinian public, but that was not what sparked the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was planned carefully by the Palestinians, with the support, or at least the acknowledgement, of Yasser Arafat and his inner circle. And if it wasn't, Sharon's entrance to visit to Temple Mount happened to coincide with these Palestinian plans. But that Israeli intelligence later on, in many other reports, had clear indications this was bound to happen with Sharon's visit or without Sharon's visit.
Go ahead. Did you want to
I just wanted to say, if I may, it's not just intelligence that has corroborated that view as well. I think history has proven that was the case. Of course, it was an inflammatory act in some senses, and in many ways, I'm sure it was designed to be. It was designed to say, Jews have a right to go to the holiest place in the world for Jews, and that was his intention in doing that. But not necessarily to inflame violence. And in fact, since then, Imad Faluji, the Palestinian Authority communications minister, admitted months after the visit that the violence was planned in July, far in advance of anything that could be called a provocation. His words were that the violence was planned since Arafat's return from Camp David. Since then, Arafat's own widow, Suha, admitted that Arafat told her to stay in Paris as soon as he returned from Camp David, because in her words, he said, "You should remain in Paris because I'm going to start an intifada." So it was clear for everyone to see, and indeed the conclusion of the Mitchell report in May 2001 was, and it's a quote, "The Sharon visit did not cause the Al-Aqsa intifada." So I think it's a great injustice that has been repeated over and over again today, and during the week after, the days after his passing, when I think history proves that however inflammatory Palestinians did find his presence there, it was not by any means what started this pre-planned and pre-prepared violence, least of all because he went there with prior agreement, and there was an agreement with Palestinian security chief Jabril Rajoub, who had given his assurance that if Sharon didn't enter the mosques, there would be no problem, and sure enough, he did not attempt to enter any mosque, and his 34-minute visit to the Temple Mount was conducted during normal hours when the area is open to tourists. So again, we mustn't recycle errors that were made perhaps in the fog of war now, so many years later again.
Dan Arbell, wanted to ask you, we talk about the Second Intifada coming out of this breakdown of these peace negotiations, and we see this kind of ebb and flow. Perhaps we get close, and there's a breakdown, violence ensues, and then, more of a push to try to get somewhere, and then which leads to Sharon with this move in 2005 to remove settlements from Gaza. Some say that was just politically expedient. There were only, maybe it was, I think, 7,000 settlements there, and large a Palestinian community, and this is what was just necessary and easy given the choices he had. But others say no, this was a really tough decision made, which ultimately led to a fissure with the Likud party, and that it really had some political costs. How hard was that decision for Sharon, and did it move the process forward in a significant way?
It's a very big question, and as you've mentioned, in the Gaza Strip, We're talking about almost 30 settlements and almost over 8,000 settlers who were uprooted from their homes during that unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. But we have to understand the background. The background was a very bloody second intifada in which over 1,000 Israelis lost their lives and thousands of Palestinians lost their lives. Sharon coming to the conclusion that he could not trust at the time the Palestinian Authority's leadership, namely Abu Mazen, who inherited Arafat, and realizing that the Israeli public is sick and tired of this acts of terrorism and have given up on the peace process as we know it in the aftermath of the Oslo days, and seeking separation, clear separation, Israelis from Palestinians, not having anything to do with each other, and realizing that perhaps the best way to achieve it was to physically separate from one another. And since he did not trust the Palestinian leadership, he sought a solution in which Israel would unilaterally withdraw from the Gaza Strip, leaving these settlements with all the pain that he, as the father, the architect of the settlement movement, had to go through in order to go ahead and carry out the decision that he made. And so in late 2004, early 2005, preparations were made for the withdrawal in the summer of 2005. So I think, to sum it up, I think that he clearly thought that this would serve Israeli strategic interests and the Israeli desire, on one hand, to have a peaceful lives, but not necessarily to have a daily interaction with the Palestinians, but rather separate from them. I think for him personally, it was a painful decision. As I've mentioned, he was the father of the settlement movement, and he wasn't obviously thrilled from the reactions and the very harsh reaction that he received from his own constituency, whether in the Likud party or in the settler movement. But he made a decision, and that was one of the things about Sharon, that once he decided, he carried it out. He was a leader, and he was a very decisive leader. And at the end, he's achieved what he wanted. In retrospect, was it a smart decision? Was it not? There's still a debate going on about that. And there are those who say that it was smart. There are those who say that, that what's enabled Hamas to rise in Gaza, to kick out the Palestinian Authority, to continue with the rocket firing into Israel. Others say that, it got Israel out of this mess and the Gaza mess. And at least, much less Israelis have been physically hurt from any violence from the Gaza Strip.
Dmitry Maryasis, when we look at the current state of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and we see there is a lot of tension still there, especially because of the friction between Israel and the United States right now, whether it be over the Iranian issue with how to go about trying to get them to walk back their nuclear program, or even how American academic institutions are boycotting Israel in this way. How can Israel and the United States work together when there is so much friction right now between the two countries and given the distance that there is right now?
First of all, I think we have to understand that it's politics, and politics is the way how we use all the possibilities to cooperate. I think there is no doubt that Israel and U.S. administration have to work together to solve different issues, different problems, because, for example, now under the guidance of the U.S. administration, there is now a negotiation process which is not quite a good and positive process, but the negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. And I think that even though people try to speak about some problems between U.S. and Israel, we have to understand that all the interests of the United States are their inner security and their inner goals. Even though they're ready to protect Israel, we have to understand it for sure that, first of all, they need to solve their own problems and to achieve their own goal. And sometimes Israel doesn't match perfectly in the goals of the United States, and it's quite understandable. That's why, of course, there are some problems, and we have to admit it and to understand that Sharon was not the architect of this situation. And moreover, I think that Sharon did show for the whole world that Israel, when it understands the need to do so, is ready to painful steps. Really, I remember 2005, the August of 2005 very well. Israel was really on the brink on the citizens' war. There were lots of people who were disappointed and were ready to fight to the army, to the Israeli army. And it is important that Sharon, I think, perfectly understood what he was doing, and he did it, and he showed to the whole world that Israel is ready for painful steps if it understands the logics of what it's doing. And I think that now Israel shows to U.S. its own attitude to different issues towards Iranian issue, towards Palestinian issue, and it tries to show to the world, not only to U.S., there is politics and diplomacy all over. I mean, Netanyahu in November visited Moscow, and he met with Hollande in Tel Aviv, explaining the position of Israel towards the most important issues of Israel. And it's not always following the politics of the United States. I think it's natural, it's understandable.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, I want to talk about a little bit of the worldwide perception of Israel right now. And some are saying, there is a perception that they do not respect human rights when it comes to Palestinians, when it comes to the treatment of Palestinians who are living behind these huge walls, either in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, and that you look at the legacy of Sharon with the settler movement, with his decision as a military commander and things we've discussed already, and that is the lasting legacy. And that's really why it's hard for Israel on the world stage. You look at how the ascension of Palestinians in the UN and the sympathy they have throughout the world, and they said, look, there's too many things that point to of how Israel has treated Palestinians that make it very hard for others around the world to have sympathy for the Israeli point of view. What do you make of that?
I think there's a wide base of support for Israel's position around the world, but you are right to say that has shifted somewhat in recent years. But these things aren't fixed at any point in history, and only this week we've seen even the Australian foreign minister somewhat changing her perspective on how we should talk about settlements, for example, saying that she prefers not to refer to them as illegal under international law because she says that it prejudges any kind of negotiation that can happen regarding those settlements. Now, that's a relatively rare point of view to hear from a foreign minister like that these days. You're quite right. But it is interesting that we're starting to hear voices like that again. And I think that it's not necessarily the legacy of Sharon that settlements were enlarged, and that's all we have to say about the matter. We can't ignore that Sharon did what he thought was right for the state of Israel at every stage of his career, and in a strange way that made him a rather unusual politician because he was almost free from ideology. He didn't tend to act in an ideological way from left or right. He tended instead to act strategically according to what he thought was in the interests of the state. For example, having been the father of the settlements, as defense minister he evicted thousands of Israelis from settlements in Sinai to fulfill Israel's treaty with Egypt. And similarly, as we've discussed earlier in the program, he withdrew Jewish presence entirely and any settlement and occupation from the Gaza Strip, albeit unilaterally. So I think that Israel's position is uniquely complex in the world, and it's one which many countries judge according to simpler terms than they ought to. And I think that is a battle for Israeli politicians. It is important for them to constantly make their case and constantly, as they do, to show that they're always striving to respect human rights. And of course, where they fall short of any human rights levels that we should expect of them, they do often go out of their way to put in place commissions and investigations. And again, we can look at the life of Ariel Sharon for a prime example of that. I mean, it's almost unheard of that a country like Israel would put in place the Kahan investigation into what happened at Sabra and Shatila and would come out and say what it did about his partial responsibility indirectly for what happened there. And it's, again, highly unusual for a state. I saw in an interview rerun this week with him when he said he must be the only defense minister in the world who had to resign because Christian Arabs killed Muslim Arabs. This from the defense minister of the only Jewish state in the world. And one can understand his frustration there. Again, that's the frustration of Israel all over. It's that they have this presence in what is their historical homeland, but because of the history of the whole conflict, they're in a situation where they're surrounded on all borders by countries that don't want them there or which have attacked them at various times in the past, or that today are under the influence of some of the most extreme and terrifying regimes that they've been under the influence of in decades. And so it's in a uniquely complicated position, and it has the dual challenge of trying to maintain its security whilst respecting the human rights of its neighbours and justifying that to the world constantly with this incredible gaze of the world media and world politicians on this tiny little country which is just doing its best, so far successfully, to survive.
Dan Arbell, about the uniqueness of Israel, being a Jewish state. Just this past weekend, we had Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas reaffirm his position to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And he said, we won't accept the Jewishness of Israel. We are asking for the 1967 borders. When you talk about that and you think about Israel being a homeland for Jews, and that is, at its very core, its very foundation, and you have Palestinians rejecting that very notion, it seems like that is something that really is going to be very hard to overcome. How have various statesmen tried to breach that impasse, and how did Sharon try to address that issue, that very core issue?
One of the main reasons that Sharon was advocating for and decided and then carried out the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza was exactly connected to what you're saying, realizing that late in his public life, after being a military man and for so many years, that peace is the only way that Israel can remain Jewish and democratic. And those many who know him closely, either worked or were his friends, say that if he would have remained alive or not slipped into a coma at the time that he did, he would perhaps then also carry out the same thing that he did in Gaza in the West Bank. He would, of course, try and achieve a solution, a diplomatic solution, or through negotiations in the West Bank, but if he would realize that there is no partner, as he thought, when he withdrew from Gaza, then he would do the same thing in the West Bank. And so realizing that for Israel, in order to remain the Jewish state, and a democratic state, these are the actions that need to be taken. These are the actions that need to be carried out. As for the issue that is now on the negotiations table between Israel and the Palestinians with the support or the facilitation of the current Secretary of State, John Kerry, this issue of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state is a very hot topic, which Israel is insisting upon and is not budging on this at all, not willing to accept anything but a Palestinian recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. Palestinians, on the other hand, haven't given up their notion of the right of return of Palestinians to all parts of Palestine. And so I think that these two issues will be played out in the near future. It's very, very hard to bridge the gaps that exist over them, and that's why I personally remain skeptical as for the chances of this process, with all the admiration to Secretary Kerry's efforts, to actually succeed, because the parties are so far apart on these such fundamental issues.
We just have about a minute left, but I wanted to turn to Dmitry Maryasis one more time and ask him about some of the things that Dan Arbell just brought up. And what kind of leadership do you think needs to be in place from Israel, from the Palestinian Authority, to really get through these impasses? Someone who's a bulldozer like Sharon, or someone who wants to compromise and find other solutions? What do you think needs to happen?
First of all, I think that both sides need to have a leader, because it's I'm not the only one who is speaking about it, but we all know that there is a problem of leadership on both sides, on the Israel side and the Palestinian side, because everyone admits that Sharon was a leader, was a true leader, was bright, and maybe sometimes he really believed in what he was doing. He was not a politician. He was really a national leader who cared about the state, who cared about Israel and the citizens of the state in the way he understood it. So he was ready, and he was ready to compromise. You see, he was ready to change his position if he understood that he was wrong previously, or it is not. Maybe he was right by then, and now the situation has changed. We saw it several times, and now we have to understand that now Israel have to have a leader who clearly understands what he wants and is ready to implement the strategy, the clear strategy, and this will bring to compromise. This will bring to the solutions that both sides will accept.
I'm going to have to jump in there because we're out of time. That is Dmitry Maryasis. He is a research fellow at the Israel Department at the Institute for Asian and Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He joined us from Moscow. In London, we're joined by Jonathan Sacerdoti. He is a political commentator and Middle East analyst. And here in our DC studios, we're joined by Dan Arbell, a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. He's also a veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service. Thank you all so much for participating in our international panel.